They were refugees of a lost war, the boat people, and they became pursuers of the American dream. Less than a half century later, they're a major ethnic group, part of the social fabric, especially here in Orange County, home of Little Saigon. They're Vietnamese Americans. What do their stories say about them and about all of us? Are there lessons for our current debates over immigration, assimilation, and patriotism? We'll hear from two people involved in an ambitious oral history project. UC Irvine professor Linda Vo and Wells Fargo Vice President Jack Toan, right now on Inside OC. Inside OC is brought to you by...
Each new community 5 Point brings to life represents a promise delivered. Great neighborhoods are more than just places to live, they are places to connect. 5 Point is a proud sponsor of public television and community programming.
Memorial Care is transforming the way healthcare is delivered, keeping our communities and businesses healthy by guiding them on the path to wellness with easily accessible hospitals, physician offices, and outpatient centers. Memorial Care, leading the way.
He's going to show you a demonstration.
Yeah, okay. Hi, I'm Rick Reiff, and I'm talking with Linda Vo and Jack Toan. Great to have both of you on. And, you know, before we get going any further, I want to talk about each of you a little. Linda, I know you were reticent to do that, but I think that the two of you really personify what this show is about, and that is the achievement of the American dream, the pursuit of the American dream, because for you, this oral history project at UCI is more than just an academic exercise. It's part of your life. So explain your own background.
Mm-hmm. I came to the U.S., particularly in California, in 1979, and I started high school here, and it was very difficult at the time in the empire. There were very few Vietnamese Americans, and I didn't see myself reflected in the history books, and this is part of why I've done the oral history project.
And now you are a distinguished professor at UCI, but talk about your beginning. You know, where were you born? Where did you grow up?
I was born in Vietnam, and so I left as a child. And then
you lived on a dirt, in a hut, in a thatched hut with a dirt floor in the Mekong Delta.
Exactly. Yes.
And now you're a professor
at
UC Irvine.
Right.
Enough said.
In some ways, yes. I was raised by my grandmother because my mother and my parents weren't around to take care of me during the war. They were doing what they could to survive. And so I was very, very fortunate to have made it, to be alive during the war and to have made it out, and very privileged to have a college education and to be a college professor as well.
Jack, you're a bank official, a community affairs manager for Wells Fargo Bank. Where were you born?
Thanks for having us on, Rick. So I was born in Vietnam as well. I was born in Hanoi, and grew up there until I was 8 when we left. At the time there was a tension between Vietnam and China, and we were ethnic Chinese who we were born and raised in Vietnam, and we felt so forced to leave. And so my family, in the middle of the night, woke my brother and myself up, and we started our journey in escaping from Vietnam.
And tell us a little more about that journey. Don't leave us hanging now. So you get up in the middle of the night. Yeah. What happens?
So we ended up on a boat, and we sailed to Hong Kong. There's a refugee camp there, and of course, there's an interesting journey along the way, and there's a lot of risk involved, and I think some of the stories been captured talk a lot about some of those risks. But for us, we had encountered a situation where the boat almost sank, and so it was a scary time. As a father, now I think about the decisions my dad had to make to take his family and put the family at risk to escape for freedom.
And you said it was middle of the night. Just getting from from your house to the boat was a risk.
Yeah. So we had to escape in the cover of night, and so that was definitely not sort of get on a cruise and let's sail out of here.
Yeah, yeah. And Linda, how about your own? Did you have to escape?
Actually, I have a slightly different story in there. So I left I came to the U.S. in '79, and I was actually an immigrant, classified as an immigrant. I became a naturalized citizen on there, so I took
And you
off
were
of a
allowed
plane.
to go?
Yeah, because of my mother had remarried someone who was an American citizen, and that's how I was allowed to leave there, and I came as an immigrant.
Okay,
Yeah.
so let's talk, to set this up, your stories are not, I mean, are typical in many ways, but what was the first big wave? Haven't there been like a couple of waves?
Right, there have been, and I think people don't understand that there were a number of Vietnamese here, a small number, pre-1975. Of Vietnamese who were here as international students, some who were military personnel, and some were international brides or war brides.
So let's walk us through that a little, Linda. Let's take a look at some photos and explain to us what we're looking at, because I think they kind of help picture what this story is. And these, I think, are pictures that are from your oral history project. So what's this first picture that we're looking at?
Yeah, and this is during the oral history project. We've learned so many different stories on the diversity of the community. And the photo you're looking at is of Young Pham, and she came to the U.S. and to Texas and went to the university to study nursing in early 1960s. And she was actually at
Is she the one on the left in the photo, or?
She's the one on the right.
On the right,
on the photo. And she was actually at the hospital when President Kennedy was assassinated and was brought into the hospital. She was a nursing student at that time. So she completed her nursing school in Texas and goes back to Vietnam, marries someone who's in the military, the South Vietnamese military. In 1975, he's imprisoned, and she later comes, she takes care of the children. He's released from prison finally, and they're able to leave in the 1980s. They leave Vietnam, but they don't go to the U.S. They're able to be sponsored to France because her father-in-law served in the French military. And then eventually they were sponsored to the U.S. in there. So they come as refugees later on.
What's the second picture that we're looking at?
This picture is taken in the late 1960s. There were Vietnamese military personnel who came here and were trained by the American militaries because of the Vietnam War. And then they go back to Vietnam and fight with the U.S., against the North Vietnamese during the Civil War, the Vietnam War.
And some of those guys wound up coming back to the United States as refugees? And
they do in 1975, and then even as boat people later on. But many of them, because they had worked with American military personnel, they were imprisoned in re-education camps. And they're not camps, they're really prisons where many of them were tortured or killed, made to do hard labor, and many over a decade or more. And then the U.S. helped to sponsor them and their families here to the U.S.
Wow. What's this next picture?
This picture is of Camp Pendleton, and this is a woman we interviewed who came here in 1975 in the last days of the war with 9 children. She went home on the last days of the war, had an hour, got her 9 children, packed, each of them were able to pack a backpack of stuff. They were supposed to meet their father or her husband at the airport. They get on the plane, they get out in 75. Because of the bombing at the airport in Vietnam, he could not leave. And so he was sent to the re-education camp and was imprisoned for over 12 years and was not able to rejoin the family till 14 years later. But she settles here, raises her 9 children by herself, working as a seamstress. And so this is a picture of them at Camp Pendleton, where they're here in 1975.
Wow. And do you know any of these kids by any chance, or what became of them? We
actually interviewed some of them, and the one you see on the right is Dr. Hung. She went to medical school at UC Irvine, is working as a doctor today, and many of her siblings, they almost all college educated, and many of them work in the medical profession today. And when they came here in order to help their mom, the older children worked at McDonald's.
Wow, that's an immigrant success story.
And in some ways, their father was able to join them for 14 years later. And he lived for another 10 years and has since passed away. But can you imagine what that was like, not seeing your husband or your father for 14 years?
Yeah. So finally, let's look at this. What's this picture that we're looking at?
And these are the documents. Not only do we collect oral histories and we learn about their stories, we record them, we videotape them, and we transcribe them, and we put them on our website. They're free and accessible to the public and to the world. But we also started collecting documents and photographs, and we attach them. And it's all digitized on the internet.
And so what are these pictures here?
These are pictures of the refugees and the papers when they're being processed in the refugee camps.
Are they like ID cards?
They're ID cards that you need before you get sent to
I noticed it says Indonesia. They're stamped Indonesia.
Right, so like Jack's family, many of these individuals escaped by boat in the late 1970s and the 80s and even the 90s, and they went to countries through the South China Sea. They escaped and went to Hong Kong or Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, Thailand, the Philippines. They were processed there before they were accepted by a country that would accept them permanently and found a sponsor, which was very difficult to do. So many had brief stays, but majority of people had much longer stays, some for years before they could find a relative or a religious organization or a charity that would sponsor them permanently.
So Jack, these are stories you're familiar with, and Wells Fargo is a sponsor of this project, right?
Yeah, we were one of the first ones to step up to support the project as a corporation, and we currently actually have a challenge grant out. We gave $50,000. We're putting out $50,000 as a challenge grant for the community, because this is really the community story, and we want everyone to be engaged in supporting and the work of the Oral History Project, and so we're ready to match the donations that come in.
Yeah. What do you think? What for you is the one or two takeaways from this? When you hear these stories, you know your own story. What is it you want people to understand?
You know, as I get older and I watch my kids grow up, I think a lot about the past, how we got here, all the things that my parents went through, and the struggles that they had. And a lot of times these stories aren't told within the community. There's a lot of people that came with a lot of trauma, and they choose to forget about that. Even asking my parents is very difficult to get the full story. They'll give you generalities, and you have to dig a little bit. And it's because they want to move forward. They have the dream of their children getting a college education, acclimating to a new country, and being successful, taking care of their family. So as I think about that with my own kids, I want them to have a little history of where they came from, who they are, and I think it is an opportunity, especially for the generation that are born here now. A lot of them don't even really know their parents' story, and this is an opportunity to tell that story and to be able to tell it from the perspective of the community, not the way it was written in the history book from another perspective.
Right. So what is that perspective as far as what were some of the most trying things, the difficult things? Was it discrimination? I mean, what were the things that were big hurdles?
I think there's certainly discrimination. Anytime there's a new community that sort of very quickly flow into the U.S., you can look at the American history and not even talking about minorities, but go back to the Irish, for example. But for me, as an example of what our family went through, when we first came, the congregation of the church that sponsored my family took turns patrolling our house because they were concerned about certain groups within the community that did not want us there.
Well, you were taking over neighborhoods, right? I mean,
we were the only family there, so we weren't taking over any neighborhoods.
This is in South Carolina.
This is in South Carolina.
All right. Okay. All right. This is all right. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. So we didn't. When we first immigrated, we didn't come to Southern California. We were sponsored to go to South Carolina, in a very small town, and to the point where my parents said, you should identify yourself as Chinese to prevent any kind of problems that their hard feelings they may have because of the war.
Yeah. So what were to pick up on that point here in Southern California, particularly in what we now call Little Saigon? You had people moving in. Suddenly, all these people are settling. I had heard years ago about people complaining they're taking over the neighborhood. We have to move and things like that. How big an issue was that, and are there still repercussions from that today?
Yeah, I think, if you look at the Vietnamese refugees and the Cambodian and Laotian refugees that came at the same time, we have to remember that the Vietnam War had just ended. And for many Americans, that was a very difficult war. It was a war where there were many veterans that had come back. It was a war we had not won in some ways, we had lost. And so there was a lot of misunderstanding about who the Vietnamese were. And if you look at the polls at the time, the American public was not supportive of sponsoring or allowing Vietnamese refugees to come to this country.
And when you do these histories, these stories, were the people, were they conscious of that we're in this new land and we're not wanted?
Yeah, they were, for the most part. They'll talk about, their experiences and their challenges, but they also talk about generous individuals who sponsored them, who helped them find a home or helped them find a car, helped them find a job. Americans or religious organizations or communities where Jack settled across the country that welcomed them. And so those pockets, in those neighborhoods really helped them adjust and acclimate. So you can imagine the trauma of just leaving your home within hours and then arriving here in 1975, that group that came. They were processed, many of them Camp Pendleton, and then they were looking for places to live. Where can they find affordable homes? And Southern California, Orange County reminded them of home. It's the weather here. There were job opportunities, there were educational opportunities, and there were communities of Asian Americans that helped them feel more welcome. And this is why Southern California and California has the most populations of Vietnamese.
And to that point, let's take a look at some numbers here. And what we're looking at here, first of all, the Vietnamese community is almost 2 million people now in the United States. It is the 4th largest Asian ethnic group after the Chinese, Indians, and Filipinos. So it's the 4th largest. You can see Orange County has the largest concentration of Vietnamese Americans, 184,000, San Jose about 126,000, and Los Angeles close to 90,000. And also where Vietnamese Americans live in Orange County, and here you see Garden Grove has the most, then Westminster, Santa Ana, Anaheim, Fountain Valley. There's still, I think, 30% or so that are elsewhere in Orange County, which would include both of you, right? You live in South County, Linda, and Jack, you're in Irvine.
I'm in Irvine.
All right. So, Jack, you mentioned before that you want your kids to know this. Is it a whole different ballgame now for the Vietnamese kids growing up now?
I think it is a very different ballgame. But because if you're born here, you adopted the Western mentality. You adopted the American mentality. I think you may not hold on to the language, although many do, because their parents are focused on making sure they speak the language. But I think a lot of them also lose the language. And even my kids, they identify themselves as Americans, and so giving them that history of where they came from and what to hold on to and is really important, because I think we all at some point want to find out where we're from, what is our story, and if we're able to capture those stories, at least they'll have a place to go to and say, oh, okay, this is our family history.
Linda, is that part of the success? The kids lose the language. Isn't that what happens when a group becomes assimilated and, if you will, fully American?
To some extent, the second generation that grows up, there's such a diversity here. And I think having a sense of identity in your history is important for many of them. And that's, I think, why the Oral History Project has been so important and has been so successful. Just like Jack said, we are very focused on the first generation, 30 years and up. The older, the better. And they're feeling a sense of, when they pass away, their children don't know their full stories. Their grandchildren won't know anything, basically. And that's how we convince them to tell us their story, is to say, we're preserving this forever for your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren, because our history is not written in Vietnam, those of us who left. And then in the American history books, it was very focused, if you talk about the Vietnam War, on American veterans, but not on Vietnamese Americans. And so we're really capturing an important legacy for future generations, an important part of American history.
And in fact, this project we're talking about, if folks they can go online, right? I mean, there's a website. What's the website they can go to?
If they can just put Viet Stories or Vietnamese American Oral History
That's
Project.
the easiest way.
That's
Just Google Viet Stories. You can probably throw UC Irvine in there too, but it will come up, and that's the best way to do it. There was, I guess this could be part of arriving. The Vietnamese American community now has a Pulitzer Prize winner, Viet Thanh, who this past year won the Pulitzer Prize in Literature for a novel called The Sympathizer, which is all about, I mean, it's a fictionalized version, if you will, rather provocative. The protagonist is a communist mole who has infiltrated the South Vietnamese army, and he winds up coming over here and carrying out a couple assassinations for the general he's spying on, and it's a pretty wild novel. But a lot of things in there, characters, expatriate generals, U.S. congressmen, a lot of people in there who you could say, oh, that's who that person was referring to. How has that novel been received in the Vietnamese community?
Well, I think the Vietnamese community is very proud of Viet, who's been a longtime friend of mine.
And he's a longtime friend, and he's a
colleague.
Professor and a professor at USC, right?
Right, he's a professor in Asian American Studies, which is what I do. And we come from a generation where, there were many doctors in computer science and engineers. So for him to be a professor of literature, and I came out of sociology, that was very uncommon. There weren't many Vietnamese. Now you see them in all different professions. And but his story is just reflective of what he saw in the Vietnamese community. Of someone who is more 1.5 generation recall, or a second generation. And you can see their perspectives. They're bringing out stories and writing novels or making movies, in the entertainment industry. So just telling our stories from all different perspectives. And so there are artists and writers who use our website for that purpose. They take these stories and then they actually, fictionalize them or create art out of it as well. And that's what we want. We want people, students to use this, but we would love artists, reporters, as well as writers to use these stories to create, art and to write our histories in multiple ways.
Jack, there's the generational battles. There's oftentimes it seems are the protests over communism becoming less, or are they still there? Every time there was a parade, there'd seen the protester because somebody was doing something that was suggestive of the communist flag or something, and people are protesting. Is that a generational thing, and is that going away, or is it still there?
I think it is definitely a generational thing, and it's definitely still there. These are very strong feelings. If you put yourself in the perspective of the generation that essentially had to leave their home, lost their homeland, just their livelihood taken away from them. And it makes sense why this feeling are so strong. And the persecution and the trauma that came along with that. I think though the younger generation that are growing up here, I think want to look beyond that. But it's not gone yet. I think there's a little bit less and conversations are starting, but it definitely still continues to be an issue in the community.
I'm curious, have either of you been back to Vietnam?
I have not.
You have not?
I have, yes.
And what was that? Academic curiosity, or what was your motivation there?
I wanted to visit my grandmother and my aunts and other relatives there as well.
Who you had never seen?
I hadn't seen them since 1975, since the end of the war, and so it was a long time.
Was it emotional?
It was very, very emotional, and it is for many Vietnamese Americans, although there's some who refuse to go back for political reasons, or others because they can't financially afford it. But there's a number of Vietnamese Americans who do go back to Vietnam to visit family, relatives, start nonprofits, do business there. But I think our communities are going through a healing process and still are. Although there was a really vibrant Vietnamese community here, as you can see, with many younger generations starting business, Vietnam's changed. And I think for many American veterans, military veterans who are going back to Vietnam, they're actually welcomed, and they will see a very different Vietnam than when they.
Any lessons for what's going on with our whole debate nowadays about illegal immigration and concerns about immigration in the United States?
Yeah, I think there are many lessons to be learned. You know, one of the things that we remember, like I said, was Southeast Asian refugees, including the Vietnamese, were not necessarily welcomed here in the U.S. There were a lot of suspicions and fears about them. But we have to learn from the stories. These are humanitarian issues. Look what happened to the Vietnamese. You know, we came here because we had nowhere else to go. We were forced to flee our homelands. And we started with basically nothing. And look what we created politically, economically, socially, culturally, that we want to give back to community. And we have. And
Yes,
I think, you know, giving other refugees and immigrants an opportunity to do the same.
And I think you're both great examples of that. Thanks so much for coming on and sharing your stories.
Thanks for having
thanks
us.
for having
Okay, that's it for now. Thanks again to my guests, Linda Vo and Jack Toan. You can watch this show and past shows by going to pbssocal.org or rickreiff.com. You can also catch our shows and our post-show open mic chatter on YouTube. And follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again on Inside OC. Inside OC is brought to you by
Each new community 5 Point brings to life represents a promise delivered. Great neighborhoods are more than just places to live, they are places to connect. 5 Point is a proud sponsor of public television and community programming.
Chapman University is a proud sponsor of Inside OC and community programming.